It's Halloween, so I guess it's that time of the year where I have to remind everyone that Billy and Mandy exist. It almost feels like a yearly tradition, but that's a fucking lie. I've definitely skipped some years, so there's a lot that has happened these past few months. Apparently, there was a merger that occurred between Warner's and Discovery, which caused some projects to be swept under the rug. One of the bigger victims of this was Cartoon Network, ranging from staff getting cut down, series that were in the works getting cancelled, and some shows getting axed from HBO Max. I didn't cover this incident despite me being very much aware of it, and that was because, well, for one, I frankly just didn't have time to research exactly what was happening, and other people were following the events a lot more closely, so I didn't feel qualified to talk about it. But the other reason was that for the most part, I kind of felt numb about the whole situation because it was something that I kind of knew was going to happen eventually. The way Cartoon Network has been managed over the years has always been kind of hazy. I mean, initially, the channel was created because Ted Turner had acquired a huge library of old MGM, Hanna-Barbera, and Warner's cartoons to the point where they decided to launch a channel dedicated to airing those cartoons. Eventually, they decided to experiment with original series, and it worked well enough that an entire studio was made for developing original IPs. Although at the same time, with Warner's having such a massive pool of brand recognition, there was also a lot of Warner Brothers cartoons, whether they were DC Comics, Hanna-Barbera stuff, or other WB-owned IPs. Then things started to get really weird around the time AT&T acquired Time Warner, where it seemed like the distinction between Cartoon Network Media and Warner Brothers Animation was becoming murkier. The management of both departments started to overlap even more than previously, and I knew that eventually this corporate bouncing would end up biting Cartoon Network in the balls little down the line when the transition of licenses and management carried out more and more. Now, my prediction was that eventually Cartoon Network would still remain its name, but the identity and culture would dissipate over time, which to be honest, I already felt like it was happening during the late 2010s. Although there was one thing that gave me hope, and that was the studio itself becoming more involved in adult animation, particularly with Genny Tartakovsky's contributions, and with the news that he had creative freedoms to dive into CN original IPs from the 2000s, this actually gave me some hope that they were starting to acknowledge the existence of people from my generation, and hopefully a lot of memorable cartoons from my childhood would get revived, except with a passionate team working on it instead of some out-of-touch reboot. At the moment, I have no idea what's going to happen with that, although one thing I will say is that this merger with Discovery did result in one thing that I warned people would happen, which was that a lot of stuff would get pulled out from the streaming services, not just Cartoon Network content. This is why I don't like streaming services. A lot of the times it feels like I'm paying money to consume something that, for all I know, could get removed like tomorrow. This is also one of the reasons why I haven't paid for PlayStation Plus Extra or Premium, because bitch, I would rather just buy the games. Spider-Man Miles Morales isn't gonna go away from my library if there's some fucking license disagreements that occur between Insomniac and Sony. You wanna know why? Because I have the game right here with me. They can't do anything about it. They can't fist me in the asshole by revoking my license. It's my game. If I pay for HBO Max, I don't own any of the Cartoon Network libraries. I have no control over the access to these shows. So if they disappear from the service, well, fuck. All of the money I spent just to have the privilege of revisiting my childhood has been completely wasted. The only time I pay for streaming services is with anime. I'm pretty much subscribed to the three main ones, and it's mostly because television series get released in weekly schedules, and oftentimes they only get physical releases months after they were originally broadcasted on TV. And since I don't live in Japan, and even if I did, if there's one thing I hate more than streaming services, it's TV. I'll bite the bullet and pay for the crap tier, although admittedly cheap streaming services, just for the sake of watching some anime. But I guess as far as my parting statements, am I mad about all of this? Listen, prior to me finalizing the script for this video, I remember this one music video called Ed, Edd n Eddy Incredible Shrinking Day. This MV always stuck with me because I remember when I first listened to it and I thought that the message of the song was the exact opposite feeling I was having at the time. The lyrics express how detached the author feels to his home, how he loves going outside to meet up with his friends, and how much he hates the feeling of restrainment when he's at home. I never felt this growing up. If anything, I felt more comfortable and familiar staring at my room and was alienated by the outside. However, despite the contrast of emotions, I always somehow returned to this song and enjoyed listening. Looking back, I like it even more, and even though I generally still kind of feel the same way as I felt back then, I have an easier time resonating with the lyrics. I guess because I'm more mature, more experienced, and the lyrics feel so sincere that you can somewhat connect to it. I also remember how out of character the Eds and Sarah were acting and how distinct the art style was. At the time, it was confusing to me why they went in that direction. Watching it again, I appreciate the uniqueness of the music video, and in a weird way, I miss this. Which brings me to the main point I want to make. To me, the late 90s to early 2000s was the best era of Cartoon Network. It had such creative freedom, so much innovation and unique shows, promos, segments between commercials. To me, this is an irreplaceable era of Cartoon Network, and the only period of the network that comes close to replicating this is the early 2010s. And when I look at the Cartoon Network from today, it is not the same thing I grew up with, and as a result, I don't feel attachment to what I see today. This isn't necessarily a negative thing. I understand that I'm not the target audience, and if the newer content is succeeding in getting the current generation to resonate with their shows, that's a great thing. However, any sense of betrayal I could feel from what has been happening isn't going to come out of me, especially when so much of the talent and management from past eras are no longer there anyway. Now, with that said, what happened was pretty shitty. I even heard that staff and projects were discarded without prior notice. This is a pretty awful way of managing your employees, and I definitely think the big suits deserve to be called out for that. Animators are already treated like shit, but to add even more fuel by tossing their contributions to the trash can like they're replaceable object is pretty horrible. But at the same time, for how long do I have to keep preaching the same thing over and over again? At this point, I just can't bother with it anymore. You know what I like to do now? I like following animators like Gensho Yasuda, who post banger shorts on YouTube. That's what gets me up for the day. These news about corporations doing corporation things, I guess I could complain, but at this point, I just don't even want to bother giving them my time of the day. But anyway, I don't want this video to get too black-pilled, so let's end it off with something positive, which is the fact that I finally tried out the Billy and Mandy game from a couple of years ago. It's specifically the PlayStation 2 version, although let's be clear, I ain't wasting my time taking my PlayStation 2 from my closet and try to find some HDMI adapter that's probably gonna have some input lag. Instead, I played the way God intended to, which was through emulation. Because guess what, I'm playing this game in 1080p in 60 frames per second. Honestly, I could get higher than this. Now, PCSX2 is quite an interesting emulator. You know how sometimes people say that when it comes to emulators, the CPU is what truly matters, and in most cases, this is true, but I want to show an example of the opposite being the case. So first, let's boot up Liberty City Stories, upscale to 1080p, and take a good measurement of the GPU resources. So in general, it averages at around 13%, which, not bad, at least assuming that this is accurate. Now, let's look at Need for Speed Most Wanted. And that's quite a lot of GPU usage. Fuck, even Arkham Asylum in 1440p doesn't consume that much. So yeah, bear in mind that it varies from game to game. As for Billy and Mandy, it's pretty soft. I could probably play this at 4K. Actually, let me test it for myself. I have to connect it to a different monitor. Yeah, not only can this go up to 4K while still remaining at 59-ish frames per second pretty consistently, but it also barely eats up to GPU. I can honestly imagine this going even up until 8K. Keep in mind that I have an RX 6600, a card that is generally marketed as a 1080p gaming card, but some games can be light enough that they can handle high resolutions even without FSR. And this is a very good example of that. In fact, fuck 8K, if it wasn't for the fact that PCSX2 can't increase frame rates without also increasing the speed of the playback, my goal would be to aim towards 4K in 120 frames per second. So yeah, it's a pretty light game, although I will say that I have tried to emulate this game in the past, and let's just say that if you have a crap top like I did, you're gonna have a bad experience regardless, so do keep in mind that you still need a bare minimum gaming PC to emulate this without any issues. Now with that said, I'm just gonna say it up front, this is not an easy game for me to get into. It's a fighting game that leans more towards the party game genre. It's really chaotic, and I think because I'm more accustomed to 2D fighters that have more grounded stages and careful consideration on balance in the neutral game, Eventually, after a couple of minutes, I just end up stop playing the game because there are so many gimmicks, so many traps and items to collect that I end up getting a bit of a headache. It's not entirely the game's fault, honestly. I've accepted the fact that these types of party games aren't really made for me. However, one thing that probably will keep me playing the game is the story campaign, because the writing, it's as if I'm watching this series. It has the exact same sense of humor and it's pretty amusing. But after that, I'm probably just gonna delete the game or maybe back it up somewhere else because it's just occupying space on my computer. Although I will say one thing, I'm forever grateful for this game's existence because in my old cartoon reviewing days, this game made it really easy to find the soundtrack for the series. But anyways, happy Halloween. Maybe I'll watch Jack-O-Lantern, binge watch Evil Con Carne for a little bit, and that's about it. Stay spooky.